And what we have here are three stories, and we believe God is going to guide us through them as we look at them. The first passage is the culmination of in a sense, chapter 20, where and many previous chapters where God promises all the time to Abraham that he was going to make him a great nation. And this time, rather than Ishmael being born, Isaac is born, and we'll look at that in a little more detail. Then we have the story of Hagar and Ishmael being sent away. I like the euphemism in the way the New King James puts it in the subheading. It says in that section for verse 8, Hagar and Ishmael depart as if it's a choice of their own. They were basically kicked out. And then you have this final section, which is one that we often don't reflect on, which is the covenant with Abimelech and what it tells us. Now, what we're dealing with here is some very, very powerful ancient stories that we think, oh, these are just interesting old stories. No, these stories have an effect. And if ever you've been to London, you will see how the descendants of Ishmael are still around. And I was just thinking about it as I was preparing this morning, and some of you may have been to this building in London. It is right opposite the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Science Museum, and it stands out to be a little bit strange. And as I can remember decades ago, seeing this building made of smooth granite, and wondering what on earth was it, this Ismaili Center. And then there was a conference I attended years ago, and it was held in there. And so I had a chance to look around. And as you can tell from the name, Ismaili, this is a center that was built by the Ismaili group, who claim to be direct descendants from, you never guess who, Ishmael. All right. And it is a beautiful building inside. You go up in the roof garden, and it's a place of tranquility and peace. It's a kind of mosque as well. And so there are plenty of meeting spaces in there, but also great places for conferences and so on to be had. So stories have a power. They give a meaning, and they give purpose, and they give identity to those who hear the stories and those who follow on. And what I'd like to do is to just pick up some of the key points in these stories that we're hearing today. The first section is the story, of course, of the birth of Isaac. And Isaac was 100 years old. Now, as I did the presentation last week, and the idea of an old man having a child, and especially of an older lady having a child as well, is quite bizarre. And yet God chose to perform a miracle. Now, the timing of this was intriguing, because it seems as though Ishmael was born when, how old was Abraham when Ishmael was born? Was it about 80, 86, 87 or something? Tell me if I get it wrong. But anyway, so if the numbering can be taken as accurate, then what we've got here is 13 years later or so. So you can imagine how things were for little Ishmael as he was brought up. He was brought up as the son of promise. He was brought up as the one who was going to be inheriting all of the vast wealth that Abraham had accumulated. He was the one that Abraham would have told stories to as he was going to sleep, and would have shared the promises of God, that you are my son, you are the one who's going to inherit all of this. And then can you imagine what it must have been like for Ishmael, who, suddenly at the age of 12, a young teenager, suddenly being told, none of this is coming to you anymore because I got a real son on the way. And you think, oh dear. And so later on, the story talks about Ishmael becoming a bit of a donkey by way of his character. Well, how would you have reacted if you had been raised basically in a king's palace, and then at the age of 12, 13, 14, being told, hey, no, this isn't going to be for you anymore? And so what happens is that if we can put the narrative together, we have this amazing story of Isaac being born, obedience taking place. Isaac was circumcised as God had told him to, and then you can imagine the sibling rivalry. It says that the child grew and was weaned, and the custom was in those days to have a really big celebration at the time of weaning, because in those early years, the child mortality was incredibly high during that weaning period. And I'm not quite sure why, but one commentary that I was looking at said that the weaning age tended to be around 3 years old, but it could have been older, it could have been slightly younger. But when the breastfeeding came to an end, it was seen as a particular marker, a transition point in which to have a celebration. And so it was around that time that it says that Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Now that word was, thank you very much, Joanne, for putting in 86. So basically, the child, Isaac, when Isaac was born, Ishmael would have been about 13 years old. And then if you add to it another 3 years, let's say, for when the weaning took place, you'll find that you'll get to about the age of 16 or so, 15, 16. And so what we have here is a bit of a teenager, a lad. You know what teenagers are like. You know, they can't stop teasing their siblings. And Sarah was upset by this, because this was the other woman's son who was giving her son a bit of a hard time. And so the story goes on to say that she eventually saw to it that Abraham pushed this woman who had been close, this woman who had been told in a sense that she was going to be the mother of the future descendants of Abraham, the mother who was promised that through her son that tremendous blessings were going to take place. This woman was pushed out. And in the story, it seems as though the way that she was pushed out, at least if this is all of what the story contains, is really tragic. She is sent away without a blessing. She's sent away with just some bread and a massive skin that might have held 5 gallons of water, up to that sort of amount, up on her shoulders, and she was sent away. And she met disaster. And in the middle of that disaster, when she thought that she was going to die and she didn't want to see her poor lad die, that she eventually was rescued by God. Because it says in verse 19, then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. Interesting. It wasn't just under normal vision, she should have seen that. But in this miraculous situation, God opened her eyes and there was the well. And it goes on to say that basically they grew up in the wilderness. He became an archer, a bit of a wild man. And would that be surprising, having been abandoned? in the way that that he was by his own father. And then I think what we'll do is we'll look at this story from a slightly different perspective, and that is that the story is a very, very tightly constructed story. It is just containing some very, very key elements. And commentators who've studied this story have noticed how the structural style parallels chapter 22 as well, and what happened to Isaac when he was taken as a sacrifice up the mountain by Abraham many years later. And the 6 stages for each of them are as follows. First of all, it starts off by them journeying into the unknown at the command of God. And that happened for both Ishmael and for Isaac. Then there's provision for the journey that is given. Different provisions, of course, in both cases, but they weren't sent, with just a day's provision. And then the child brought to the point of death, and with Ishmael, it was death by starvation and thirst, as you know, with Isaac. And I don't want to get in and steal tomorrow's person's thunder, but we know the story of the death being that of a sacrifice, potentially. And then chapter 4, section 4 of the story is the intervention of God's messenger, and it seems as though an angel, in verse 17 it says, an angel appears in this story and says, there is something special that I've got. And then the parent suddenly sees, as a result of the angel's intervention, the solution to the situation. In this case, there was a well. And then it finally comes out with a promise of blessing. And that is something that is paralleling between the stories and reminds us of the importance of narrative in the early in the ways that they created stories. And sometimes you wonder, why do they include certain details and leave out other details? And as you see from the pictures I've included, I look through the artists' depictions of these stories, and sometimes you have a baby that's put underneath this shrub, this tree. Sometimes it's an older lad, like in this case. In reality, it was a 16-year-old. These are the little details that the story doesn't necessarily include, that we think are important because we're used to measuring birthdays. We're used to counting these things. But the original story didn't include that. So those are a few thoughts about Hagar and Ishmael. And then the final story in this case is the story of the covenant. And I just want to give you time to respond, because this story's got so many exciting, interesting nuances that we can learn from, that I would like to just pick this out and come back to make the final point at the end after our prayer time. Now, what seems to have happened is that Abraham had dug a well, and then the greedy servants of Abimelech came along and took the well over, and it didn't seem right and fair until eventually there was a meeting of the 2 great men. They'd met before, and Abimelech says, look, I'd never heard about this problem. And there was peace made between them. And you will see how a covenant is made between people. You see, the covenant between God and us is based on human covenants. And this is a great example of how peace is brought about between people as a result of the covenant that God has given. And the place of this, of course, was Beersheba. And some of you may recognize that name because it became a byword, for the extent of Israel in the old times was from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. And this place, Beersheba, is still a town in Israel today. It's somewhat out in the wilderness, but it is a place that is remembered as the place where Abraham made this covenant.